Hello everyone and welcome to today's video. I'm so excited for today's video because it's going to be my top 10 books of 2024, and I specifically made myself choose 10 books because I was putting the list together and I had way too many books on there. I think I needed to set a number for myself just so that I could be a little more thoughtful with what books I wanted to include on this list, but I wanted to pick books that really stood out to me, that have remained in the back of my head throughout the year, and I feel like this list is just that. I have been either really moved by the writing or the characters or just the story in general. If you see that the lighting is changing, I am recording this around 3 and it's also snowing, so it's really gray out, and I'm just working with the lighting that I have. And I feel like the month of December is so jam-packed that this is really the only time I really have to record, so we're just gonna power through. This is the lighting. Oh, before we dive in, actually, I did want to go through some stats. We'll do this super quick because I love stats, so I just wanted to share what my reading was like this year. I also use Storygraph to keep track of all of these, so that's where I'm getting this information. But my top 5 moods were emotional, reflective, dark, funny, and hopeful. I feel like that's usually what I get, usually not hopeful. That's definitely a first. For pace, 3% was slow, 33% was fast, and 64% was medium paced. For page number, 2% was 500 plus pages, which I don't think I've gotten that in a while at least. 41% for books that were 300 to 499 pages long, and 57% was less than 300 pages. I participated in Shorty September, and I feel like that's probably what helped. Okay, so fiction versus nonfiction. I read 20% nonfiction and 80% fiction. Not great. I feel like that's the lowest percent I've gotten for nonfiction in a while. I usually tend to be pretty, not half and half, but I usually read much more nonfiction than that. So I think this year I just really wanted to escape. For my top 5 genres, I got literary fiction, contemporary fiction, LGBTQIA+, memoir, and graphic novel. For format, I did do a better job this year of tracking audio versus ebook versus physical books. So I read 16% on audio, 15% digitally, and 69% on print. My most read authors were Alice Oseman with 5 books, Jamaica Kincaid with 3 books, Benji Nate with 3 books, Becky Chambers with 2 books, Claire Keegan with 2 books, R.F. Kwong with 2 books, and Emily Austin with 2 books. So that's kind of impressive because I feel like this is the first year where I've read multiple books by one specific author, so that's exciting to see. I feel like that was one of my reading goals. I don't even remember. For my reading goal, I did have it set to 65, but this year was just such a slow reading year, so I did end up bumping it down to 60, and I did end up hitting it. I read a bunch of graphic novels towards the end of the year and some shorter books, and that really helps me with reaching that goal, but I am currently at 61 books out of 60 read. Now that we've gone through the stats, we can dive on into my favorite books. I will try and give a little bit of a synopsis on each of these books, and also just some of my general thoughts, as well as some quotes that have really stuck out to me. But I also know that I've talked about a lot of these in my wrap-up videos, so I don't want to talk your ear off. There's some on this list that I've talked about a bunch, so for those I might just give a little bit of an insight. Alright, I am back much later. Literally, I finished giving my stats and then our landlord got here, which is great because our heat wasn't working, so now hopefully that's fixed. The lighting is different, it is much later, but I feel like it looks kind of cozy from what I can see, so hopefully it looks kind of cozy for you. Now we can actually talk about the books that are on my top 10 of 2024. For you, it probably felt literally a second, but for me, I've been waiting an hour and a half. So I am excited to finally just start chatting about these books. And first I'm going to start with some honorable mentions. The first one that is on my honorable mentions is Natural Beauty by Ling Ling Huan. And this book I really thought was going to be top 10 for me, but the more that I was like sitting and thinking about this list and what books I had, I can't say that it stuck with me as much as some of the other books that are on this list. For a general synopsis of this book, we are following our narrator. She's unnamed, and she's like a really talented pianist, and she learned everything she knows from her parents, and she gets into this conservatory, and it is like a dream for her to be there. Something happens that then changes like the course of her life, and she ends up needing to find a job, and she starts working at this health and wellness company that's really popular and well known, and it's called Holistic. And now our main narrator is working there, and she's seeing like some of the stuff that they're doing. Just seeing her interactions with like some of her coworkers is really interesting. It has a lot to say on like the beauty industry and like the beauty standards. Something in this novel that just has stuck with me still is the relationship that she has with her parents. I thought that it was really beautiful, and they're really supportive of her, and I loved that part of the book. It was very subtle. It wasn't the main part of the book, but it was something that really, really stuck with me and I enjoyed reading about. And the next book is My Brilliant Friend by Elena Ferrante, and I think the whole series has the potential to be like an all-time favorite. For this one, it did take me a little bit to get into, but it's one that has still left an impact on me, and I am excited to continue reading the other 3 books in the series. And in this book, we are following Lena and Leela. We are seeing them become close friends, but they have a very like complicated friendship. It's very competitive, and I just feel like it was like a great take on childhood friendships and how messy it is and confusing it is. So not quite top 10, but still a really, really good read. The next honorable mention that I have is Sula by Toni Morrison. The only reason that I'm not putting it in my top 10 is just because this was a reread this year. I feel like this was on a favorites. No, it wasn't. I didn't enjoy it that much the first time I read it. The second time I read it, I had an amazing time with it. Buddy read this with Kat, and it was just so fun having someone else to talk about this book with. There's so much that can be missed, so I feel like it was great just having someone else notice things that I hadn't noticed, and it was just nice to kind of chat with someone about it. I remember reading this first time and so much went over my head, and the second time I feel like I was able to really appreciate it so much more. So we are basically following 2 friends, Nell and Sula, but even before that we get a little bit of an insight into their family before they become friends. So we get that little history. We get history on this town that they live in. As they get older, their paths definitely go into different directions. Nell ends up getting married and having kids, and Sula ends up leaving the town and going to travel and is single, doesn't have children, and there's just so much in this book. I'm just really happy that I reread this one because, yeah, I appreciated it so much more the second time around. Okay, and then the last honorable mention is Between the World and Me by Ta-Nehisi Coates. It is a very recent read, but I feel like this is just one that's gonna stick with me for a while. This is basically Ta-Nehisi Coates writing a letter to his son about what it is like to be a Black person in America. Ta-Nehisi Coates is giving a bit of history and a bit of his personal experience growing up, and also just like some insight into like some things that he notices his son notice as he's getting older. This one is beautiful. If you haven't read it yet, I highly recommend it. This is the last honorable mention. I wanted to include those because those also did have an impact on me, and like I said, I wanted to stick to 10, so I guess it's kind of cheating, but whatever. I feel like I did really, really well. Now we can dive into my top 10 books. These books are not in any particular order. They're not in like favorite to least favorite. They are just in order of like around the time that I read them. So the very first book on the list is I Who Have Never Known Men by Jacqueline Hartman, and this was translated by Ross Schwartz. This is basically about 40 or so women who are being kept underground. They're not sure how they got there. They have no memory really of how they got there. It's kind of like they just woke up one day and they were there. They do still remember like what their life was before then, but they are being watched over by some guards, and that's about all they know. One of the prisoners that is being held there was brought there when she was a child, so really, really young, and she doesn't really have any memory of her past life. All she really knows about is being held captive. This is one that I feel like just go in knowing that, and it is definitely like a bleak read, not hopeful at all, even though as I was reading it, I was kind of like finding myself having hope, but yeah, not a hopeful read at all. It's definitely one that gets you to think a lot, and it got me to think a lot. Very philosophical. I loved being in our main narrator's point of view and getting to see like how she would think about things compared to some of the other women and how she kind of viewed them and didn't really understand them and didn't want to get close to them, but also felt excluded. I remember picking it up and realizing that it had no chapters, and I was like, oh god, usually if a book has no chapters, it's just harder for me to like want to keep reading, but that one definitely pulled me in, even though it's not that it's like a lot is happening, but I just loved like the insight from our main narrator and seeing like what was happening and what would happen next. I did have a quote that I wanted to share. Is there a satisfaction in the effort of remembering that provides its own nourishment? And is what one recollects less important than the act of remembering? That is another question that will remain unanswered. I feel as though I am made of nothing else. The next book on this list is Beautyland by Marie-Helene Bertino, and I don't have a copy of this one. I listened to it on audio. Thanks to Libro FM, I got a copy through them. But in this book, it basically opens up with like Adina's birth scene, and that definitely got a little confusing at first when I was reading. I was like, I don't understand what's happening, but it's Adina's birth, and Adina basically has always felt like she doesn't belong. She's not from this planet. She's from a different planet. She's an alien, and one day she acquires a fax machine and she starts sending faxes to her home planet, and they need her help. They need her insight on human behavior so that they can try and save their planet. I think she's trying to help them save their planet. That part's a little fuzzy. But yeah, this is kind of like a coming of age story. We get to see what Adina thinks of like humans around her and like different things that they do, and she doesn't always understand why. I loved this book. I loved Adina. I feel like I just love coming of age stories and also being in the perspective of a narrator where they feel so different from everyone else, and just being able to see like their perspective I really, really enjoy. I feel like it's no surprise that this one's on the list. I feel like I've talked about it so much on my channel, so it makes sense. But I did have a quote that I wanted to share. I had a few. Dogs, she faxes, are the best we can do. So it's just that. I loved that. So I'm going to read this quote. I'm going to redact a piece of it because I don't know, it feels a little bit like a spoiler, but it says, Adina hasn't experienced romantic love like the ones portrayed in movies, or more realistic love like the ones portrayed in more realistic movies. But to love a mother who grew alongside her, to love a dog, to love vocation, to love humans, even though she didn't know. These loves were transcendent. They changed her. Another quote that I wanted to read is, every solar system has a planet capable of producing water, and that is roughly the same size as Earth. How many of these planets produce societies that destroy them? Okay, the next book that's on my list is Liliana's Invincible Summer by Cristina Rivera Garza. This book is nonfiction. It is based on true events that took place in Cristina's life. Her sister was killed by her boyfriend at the time, and this is basically Cristina going back and going through some of her journals to try and figure out not like exactly what happened, but just kind of seeing like what took place leading up to her sister's murder. It starts off with Cristina trying to get like documentation, like police reports, and she finds how difficult it is being able to get her hands on those reports, and also it's not really guaranteed, like if she goes through all the paperwork to try and get those reports, it might turn up that there's like nothing. So that's why she kind of like turns to her sister's like diaries, and she interviews her friends at the time to gather as much information as she can on what her sister's life was at that time. It takes place in Mexico City, and I feel like that adds to it because a few years back I went to Mexico City and there were places mentioned that I recognized, so that was really interesting to read about and like hear these places that I had been to or heard of or just like seen, and that was really, really cool. And this was a recommendation from Ivana. She had actually read it while we were visiting Mexico City. I'm so glad that I gave it a read. I listened to the narration of it, but I also had a library copy because there were different like diary entries, and I kind of wanted to see them within the book and see how it was done. Really powerful for Cristina to be able to kind of like tell her sister's story, and she handled it with so much care. It was just really heartbreaking to read. I didn't want to put this book down, but it was also really, really heavy and just hard to read about like the femicide in Mexico. I hope that it helped Cristina to write her sister's story, because she's writing this like several years after her sister's murder. So I can only imagine like how difficult that must have been. I have some quotes that I want to read from this one. The first one is, "Who am I now? I had a sister, and then all of a sudden I had none. We were two, and then swiftly there was only one of us. What kind of orphan are you when rendered sisterless?" And then the second quote I wanted to read was, "We are them right now, and we are in the future at the same time. We are others, and we are the same as we always have been. Women in search of justice, exhausted women, yet close together, fed up women, but bearers of centuries-old patience, already and forever enraged." If it's not on your radar, I do highly recommend it. Definitely check like the content and trigger warnings on this, but it was so well done. So glad I got to read it. I'm realizing that a lot of these books I feel like cover grief in one way or another. So the next book that is on my list is Hereafter by Amy Lynn. This is basically Amy Lynn writing about her husband who very unexpectedly passed away, and how difficult that was for her to navigate, while also she had like a health scare come up and had to deal with that at the same time that she was grieving her husband. This one, I feel like I immediately sobbed after like the first chapter, and I sobbed throughout this book. The chapters were like really, really short, and the book in general is just a very short book, but it was powerful and impactful and heavy to read. And I do have one quote. I wish I had like the book to go through, but I just have one. "I cannot believe how much pain we are asked to bear when we are alive. How, even if there is a way, no one can show us how to live with it." Yeah, this one was heavy. Again, another one that covers grief. I don't know. For some reason, I just find myself gravitating towards books that cover grief. A lot of these books cover grief. I'm just now realizing. But yeah, that was Hereafter by Amy Lynn. Beautiful memoir. Okay, and then the next book that I have on this list is Lucy by Jamaica Kincaid. I think this was the third Kincaid I read this year, and it was amazing. I loved Lucy as a character. We are basically following Lucy as she's leaving her home island to come to North America and be like a nanny for 3 kids. I don't remember how many kids. And we see that she has like a very complicated relationship with her mother, like who is back home. She's kind of like trying to escape her a bit, but also we're seeing her relationship between the mother of the kids that she's nannying and what her relationship with her looks like. And I loved like the insight that Lucy has looking at Mariah and like the things that she focuses on. Yeah, they're very, very different. And at the same time, they like kind of have this like weird love for each other. I don't know. I really, really loved this book and seeing their relationship, and just like Lucy in general, she's so different from me. I just loved being in her mindset. So this one was an absolute favorite. Kincaid's writing in general, so beautiful. I do have some quotes that I want to read. I don't know how many I'll read because there are just so many lines that I underlined. Kincaid's writing is just like next level. I'm obsessed. She is just so talented. The first quote, "Lucy, a girl's name for Lucifer. That my mother would have found me devil-like did not surprise me, for I often thought of her as godlike. And are not the children of gods devils? I did not grow to like the name Lucy. I would have much preferred to be called Lucifer outright, but whenever I saw my name, I always reached out to give it a strong embrace." And then the next quote is, "That the world I was in could be soft, lovely, and nourishing was more than I could bear. And so I stood there and wept, for I didn't want to love one more thing that could make my heart break into a million little pieces at my feet." So yeah, that's Lucy by Jamaica Kincaid. If you haven't read anything by Kincaid, do it. She is an excellent writer. Okay, so the next book that I have on this list is Magnolia Wu Unfolds It All by Chanel Miller. It was such a fun sweet book, and we're basically following Magnolia Wu. Her parents own this laundromat, and she's kind of like a little bit of a loner, but she has been keeping missing socks that she's been finding, and she's been putting it on a bulletin board, but no one seems to be paying attention to this bulletin board. And one day she has a new friend that she starts hanging out with, and her friend kind of like says, why don't we just like go out into the city and try and find who owns these socks. And so they go on this adventure. They're in the neighborhood, they're trying to figure out whose sock belongs to who, and it is just like so cute. This is middle grade, but I just loved it so much. I had to include it. I love Chanel Miller's art style and her storytelling, and I just love her brain. Anything she writes, I will read. Whatever it is, I'm going to pick it up. I don't have a quote for this one, but just know it is the sweetest book, and if you're looking for something to kind of nourish your soul, I highly recommend it. The drawings are so cute, so make sure to get like a physical copy of it from like your library, or if you buy a copy. So I highly recommend Magnolia Wu Unfolds It All. Okay, and then the next book that is on this list that I honestly wasn't sure if I was going to put it in my top 10 or not. I was debating top 10, maybe honorable mention, but the more that I sat and I thought about it, this one really stuck out to me. And after I finished it, I feel like I appreciated this book even more. I just can't get it out of my head, so it has to be on this list. And it's Monstrilio by Gerardo Samona Cordova. This is basically about a family, and their son has passed away. The mother, Magos, has taken a piece of the boy's lung and starts feeding it, and eventually the lung becomes sentient, and the family kind of accepts Monstrilio into their lives. And we are basically changing points of views between Magos, the father, Lena, who is Magos' like really close friend, and Monstrilio. So we're getting their points of view as Monstrilio is getting older, and this one is definitely a conversation around grief. So another book on grief, and I just think it's done in such like a unique way. I just like loved all of these characters, and I was really invested in all of them. Seeing like this family grow to love Monstrilio, and then seeing Monstrilio kind of grappling with who he is and how people view him. They see him kind of as a monster because he's not like everyone else, and he has like these cravings and urges. He's just kind of like struggling to like be who he really is, while also like suppressing who he is to kind of fit in. This one had to make the list. I really, really loved this one, and I'm excited to read anything else that this author writes. So I do have 2 quotes that I wanted to read. The first one is, I wanted him to snap, to finally and absolutely lose it, to break. He was withering. To wither is not the same as to break. To break is to have pieces to put back together, and to wither is to dry up and to wilt, to lose bone, to die, and death is the most boring. The other quote I have is, we didn't so much exist as much as we haunted, and with no one else to haunt, we haunted each other. Okay, and then the next one I feel like is going to be no surprise to anyone, because I feel like I've talked about it so much these past like couple videos, but it is Small Things Like These by Claire Keegan. This is the second Claire Keegan that I've read this year. I also really, really loved Foster, and I was debating between the two on which one I wanted to include in my top 10 books, but I have to say, I feel like Small Things Like These stood out to me a little bit more. This one, I don't know why, I can't like stop thinking about it. I love Bill Furlong as a character, and yeah, this is the one that I ended up putting on my top 10. So this takes place in 1985 in a small Irish town, and we are following Bill Furlong, who is a coal merchant, and one day he is doing a delivery to the local convent, and he comes across something that forces him to kind of like confront what has been going on in this town, and how people in this town have been kind of keeping silent, and what he wants to do because of his past and what he's kind of lived through. It kind of makes it hard for him to stay quiet. I do have some quotes that I want to read. The first one is, what was it all for? Furlong wondered. The work and the constant worry, getting up in the dark and going to the yard, making the deliveries, one after another. the whole day long, then coming home in the dark and trying to wash the black off himself, and sitting into a dinner at the table and falling asleep before waking in the dark to meet a version of the same thing yet again. Maybe things never change or develop into something else or new. And then another quote was, he thought of Mrs. Wilson, of her daily kindness, of how she had corrected and encouraged him, of the small things she had said and done and had refused to do and say, and what she must have known, the things which when added up amounted to a life. The next book that is on this list is The Rachel Incident by Caroline O'Donoghue. I read this one very recently and it literally put me in a slump. Nothing has been as good as this book. This book gripped me, it pulled me in, and I just absolutely loved it, so much more than I was expecting to. But we are basically following Rachel, and she's kind of reflecting back on her time in college. She has a best friend who's named James, and she's also dating this guy named James Carey, so we see their relationship, but she also doesn't call him James because she refuses to call anyone else James. Only her best friend, James, can be called James. We find out that there is something that happens that really changes like the way Rachel's life goes and the impacts that it has on her life. We are just getting to see all of that. I loved the friendship between Rachel and James, and also seeing her relationship with James Carey. There was a lot of like moments that were really heavy, and there was also so many funny moments. Like I laughed out loud reading this book so many times, and I just like loved the story. It was very immersive. The dialogue is so important to me, and the dialogue in this was just so good. I loved it. The writing was excellent. The audiobook was amazing. So if you're an audiobook reader, I highly recommend giving it a read on audio. This is just one that I knew nothing about, and it was a ride, and I was here for the ride. I just like went with it, and it was amazing. I wasn't expecting to love it as much. Wasn't expecting it to be a top read for me, but it really, really was. I have some quotes from this one. So the first one is, it's tempting when you're talking about your sex life as a young woman to slip into little melancholy asides about how you gazed heavy-lidded at the ceiling while a dull brute pummeled away at you. Sadly, I don't think I can say any of that and get away with it. The sex was unsatisfying, but I couldn't have been more obsessed with having it. And then the next quote is, the year in Shannon Street did a lot for me, but it did this most of all. It detached me from any kind of inherited moral system. I stopped sizing others up in accordance with the values I had been taught. Who was a loser, who was closeted, and who was cheating on their wife. I learned the value of context and of people. It came in handy later when I became a journalist. I can't believe it. We are on the last and final book, and I actually realized that this isn't a weird order because I did it in order of like when I read this book, except this one. I definitely read this book before like some of these previous ones, but I will say that there is no order, but this one is like in the number one spot. Out of all these books, this is my number one, and the other ones are in no order, but this one is, and it is Elena Knows by Claudia Pinheiro. I feel like if you've been watching my channel, this is probably not shocking. I feel like it probably makes sense because I just loved this book so much when I read it. It is probably the one that blew me away the most. I feel like this book to me is like my perfect read. I loved everything about it. Like I loved the dialogue between the different characters. I loved how different each of the characters felt. There was humor in it. There were darker themes. This one, towards the end, like there's a conversation that's had and it like shattered me. I think it'll be like a top book for me of like all time. I'm so excited to dive into her backlist and read more from her. So basically in Elena Knows, it takes place over the course of one day. Elena has MS, if I'm not mistaken. I always forget. I'm pretty sure she has MS, but she's basically going on this like journey to go to this one lady's house because Rita's daughter was found hanging in the church, and everyone is saying that she unalived herself, but Elena doesn't believe it. She believes that she was murdered, that someone else did this because Rita wouldn't have done this because of certain details of that day. And so she is trying to get to this lady's house, and she has to take her medication in a very specific order to make sure that she can get there and back home. She is kind of walking you through like every step that she has to take and all the things that she has to do. So I remember when I first read this one, I wasn't in like a headspace to be able to read this, and I'm so glad that I picked it back up. Her relationship with Rita was so complicated because you're seeing like Elena now have this like new disability that she's kind of having to like grapple with, and her body is like failing her now, and also dealing with like Rita now having to become her caretaker. And yeah, it is just like very complicated, the relationship. I do have some quotes that I wanted to read. The first one is, "What's left of you when your arm can't even put on a jacket, and your leg can't even take a step, and your neck can't straighten up enough to let you show your face to the world? What's left? Are you your brain, which keeps sending out orders that won't be followed? Or are you the thought itself, something that can't be seen or touched beyond that furrowed organ, guarded inside the cranium like a trove?" And then the second quote is, "Am I a mother, father? What name do you give to a woman with a dead child? I'm not a widow, not an orphan. What am I? Better you don't give me a name, father. If you and your church ever find a name for me, you'll probably just take away my right to decide how I behave or how I live my life or how I die. Better not." That was Elena Knows, my top read of the year, for sure. I loved this book. Everything about this, perfect. Those are all the books. I feel for some reason like I haven't covered these books enough, but I think it's just because I love them so much and I want other people to read them and love them as well. I would love to hear if there's any of these books that we have in common that you also read this year and that is like your favorite as well. Would love to hear in the comments down below. I was gonna kind of go through like the reading goals that I set last year, but honestly, I don't really remember a lot of them. I did want to like read more books by like authors that I've enjoyed. So like I feel like I kind of did that. Like with Kincaid, I read 3 of her books. I feel like this year, looking at like the Storygraph stats, I had a lot of authors that I've read multiple books by them. So I feel like I accomplished that. I literally don't remember what else was on that list. And I think in 2025, I'm not really going to set that many goals, if any. I think I just want to like read. I want to keep reading diversely. I want to keep finding like new favorite authors and reading from authors that I found and loved. 2024 was definitely like a very slow reading year for me, but I somehow managed to find some books that I really, really loved. So I hope to keep finding new favorites in 2025. Hopefully, I'll read some more of the books that are on my shelves because I have more than enough. And I think for YouTube, I really want to make more vlogs, whether it's like reading vlogs or just like regular vlogs. I don't know. I just really enjoy editing those and making them. So I hope that those are some videos that you like to watch. Would love to hear if there's anything specific that you'd like to see from me. I'm more than open to it. But yeah, that is it. That's all I have. This is officially a wrap on 2024. I hope that you enjoyed this video, and I will just see you in my next video, which I have no idea what my next video is going to be. So I'll just see you then. I hope that you have had a great start to the new year, because I'm posting this hopefully on the 1st of January, and I will see you in my next video. Bye.